Today's episode does not include graphic descriptions of the death of an individual or destruction of human bodies. It's just about skeletons. But if skeletons upset you, this is not the episode for you.
Welcome to Mayhem in the Morgue with your host, Dr. Kendall Crowns.
Today's episode, Skeletons in the Attic. After a person dies, their body decomposes, and there are several stages in the decomposition process. The first stage, known as the fresh stage, begins almost immediately. The cells begin to auto-digest or break down and liquefy, and this creates an environment and food for our friendly bacteria that have always been part of our lives. They are usually hanging out in our intestines, and these bacteria multiply, and without the immune system keeping them in check, they break out of their confines and begin to consume us, like a giant loaf of bread. Eventually the fluids dry up, the tissues disappear and turn to dust, and all that is left of us is our skeleton. The time it takes for the body to decompose to the skeleton is dependent on many variables, including environment, temperature, how much the person weighed, if they are buried in ground, the composition of the soil, or if they're buried in a coffin or a vault. All these variables come into play, and it can take thousands of years for us to fully disappear. The oldest known complete human ancestor skeleton that has been found, whose nickname is Littlefoot, was found in South Africa, and it is aged to be about 3.67 million years old. In the end, all that is left of us is our bones, and our bones will evidently be around for a long, long time. Sometimes our bones find their way out of the grave and go on a fantastic journey of their own. And on today's episode, we're going to discuss several instances where someone's bones went on their own adventure long after their owner passed away. When I attended medical school in the early 90s at the University of Kansas School of Medicine, in our first semester, one of our classes was anatomy. This class is, of course, when you learn about every aspect of the human body, every tiniest detail of every organ system. This is where they have the famous cadaver labs that you see in TV shows and movies about medical school. When you walk into the anatomy lab on your first day, you're struck by the overwhelming smell of formaldehyde. The bodies are lined up on gurneys that have metal tops on them that look like tents to help slow the decomposition process down. There were about 15 of these gurneys all lined up in this white sterile dissection room. The cadavers are typically acquired through bodies that are willed to science. And in the anatomy lab, you work in groups, and there are multiple students assigned to each cadaver. Every organ system is evaluated. During the semester, you spend a lot of time with the cadaver, and at any hour of the day, you might be in the cadaver lab. I remember one 2 a.m. study session looking at the nerves of the face with one of my classmates. It was always a little eerie to be in that lab late at night with all those dead bodies. But over time, just like anything else, you get used to it. The only organ system that you don't evaluate is the skeletal system. To do this, you would have to take all the muscles and tissues off the bone, and that would take too much time for students to do, and students never have enough time. To learn the skeletal system, the medical school would assign the students a set of bones. They weren't models or bone clones or whatever, but actual human bones. These bones would help give a true 3D perspective on where muscles inserted, where blood vessels and nerves course through, and other important landmarks that you just can't get with a picture. And where did the bones that we were given come from? The bones were from bodies that were donated to science or ex-cadaver lab patients. When the day came for the skeletons to be assigned, we were told to show up to the lab to receive them. When I arrived, the bones were contained in long, ancient rectangular wooden boxes that looked like tiny caskets. The boxes were hinged and had hook-like closures, and if I remember right, a plate with a number on it was affixed to one end. They were stacked up to the side of the table of the person assigning them. When they handed me my box, I opened it, checked the contents, and signed a piece of paper stating that I had received the box, the bones were complete, and I acknowledged my box number. The box contained a humerus, femur, tibia, fibula, ribs, clavicles, bones of the fingers and feet, and assorted vertebrae, and I think part of the pelvis. It wasn't a complete skeleton, but it had enough of the different bones that you could learn what you needed to know. The one thing is, it didn't contain the skull. That arrived separate. It came in a white canvas bag with a drawstring. One side of the bag was comically labeled Property of the Kansas University School of Medicine in large black ink letters. The skull was a complete human skull with attached mandible and full set of teeth. It had a number written in Sharpie on the base of it. We were told by one of the anatomy professors that we were to be the caretakers of these bones for the duration of the section of the anatomy class. He said not to write on them, to face them in any way, and definitely don't damage them, and above all, don't lose them. The skeletons and skull had been part of the school for a long, long time, and they were very expensive and hard to acquire, and they were a person after all. The professor then told us a cautionary tale of one med student who didn't listen to the warnings. He told us that the bones would be our constant companion, and we would take them wherever we were going to study them. And the unfortunate student commuted to class every day on a bus. And on this fateful day, he was riding the bus with his backpack and his bag with the skull in it. And this was before the bags were labeled. They were just plain white drawstring bags. He got to a stop for the school, grabbed his backpack, and got off the bus, forgetting the bag was in his seat, and headed off to class. The bus continued on, making stops for the rest of the day, with no one noticing the innocent white drawstring bag with a human skull in it sitting in the chair. Finally, when the bus driver got to the end of his shift and took the bus back to the lot, he was going through it, checking the bus for any trash or left items, when he saw the white bag sitting in the seat. He picked the bag up and looked inside, and what he saw was that it contained a human skull. He freaked out. He didn't know what to do. He felt he had found the skull of a person that had been murdered, that the killer had been on his bus, just carrying the dead person's head around in the middle of the day. How scary was that? The police were called, and when they arrived, they evaluated it and took it to the medical examiner's office. When the skull arrived to the medical examiner's office, they evaluated it, noticed a number at the base, and how it appeared to be an anatomic specimen. Their first inclination was, it probably came from the medical school. And they called the medical school, read them the number, and the school informed them it was indeed one of their skulls. And it was returned to the medical school, and eventually returned to the student. And he was reminded, rather sternly, not to leave the skull anywhere ever again. And after all that, we were told that the bags were then comically labeled with the large Kansas University School of Medicine. And the next time a bus driver or anybody found one, they would know it was a skull from the school, and they just had to call the medical school to return it. I lived in an apartment several blocks from the medical school, and I walked to class every day, and I would study at the library or one of the study rooms at the school between classes. Carrying the skull bag wasn't a problem. It easily fit into my backpack. The box of bones, on the other hand, was a bit more of an issue. It was bulky and awkward and problematic to carry on my several block walk. I decided to make a strap for it to make it easier to carry. I used 2 pull strings from the hoodies from a couple of my hooded sweatshirts. I braided them together, knotting the ends that I slid between the lid and the base of the box. With the box shut and latched, the strap would be held in place. Nowadays, it would have been very Pinterest-worthy. The day after I made the strap, I put it in the box and headed off to class with the box slung over my shoulder. The strap did its job, making the box easy to carry with my backpack. I walked to school very proud of my accomplishment. As I got to the school entrance, I was passing by people heading to their places of work when all of a sudden, pop! One side of the strap came out, and the box fell quickly to the sidewalk and slammed into it. Upon impact, the lid of the box exploded open, and the bones came spilling out all over the sidewalk, bouncing and making an odd crackling noises. And they came to rest on the sidewalk and on the ground next to the sidewalk. I didn't even have a chance to react before the bones were everywhere. It was just like a card game my brother always loved playing with me, called 52 Pickup. Most of the people walking by me didn't even acknowledge what had just occurred, but one person stopped. She said, "Oh no, let me help you pick this up." But when she began reaching to pick up some of the bones, I could tell in her face that her brain registered what she was attempting to help me retrieve. She paused and said, "Wait, are these human bones?" Her voice had an air of concern. I myself was quickly picking up the bones and putting them back in the box. And when she said this, I stopped and I said, "Oh yes, they're human bones, but it's okay. I'm a medical student." My answer really didn't explain the situation, because of course, saying you're in medical school will always justify carrying around a box of human remains. Her face went from concerned to alarmed, and she quickly stood up and walked away, glancing over her shoulder periodically to see where I was at. I continued to pick up the bones, not thinking about the brief encounter I had had with the passerby. I verified they were all there, closed the box, latched it, and headed off to class. Thankfully, no police showed up later to figure out who the disheveled person was in the gray hooded sweatshirt with the box of bones. The woman who tried to help me either realized she was in front of the medical school and probably thought I was telling the truth, or she just didn't know what to do. Either way, I didn't have to explain what happened. That evening, when I was back at my apartment, I checked to see what damage I had caused. I looked the box over. One of the corners was dented from the fall, but the box itself was intact and not broken. I looked at each bone. None of them were damaged. I got off lucky and would not have to pay any fines due to the accident. And above all, I wouldn't want to become yet another cautionary tale. I threw my homemade strap away and went back to carrying the box. Even though it was awkward, at least it was safe. I went home that year for Thanksgiving and took my box of bones with me. But I forgot the skull at my apartment. I planned to do some studying while I was home during Thanksgiving. On Thanksgiving Day, while the turkey was cooking and the Packers were playing the Lions on TV, I got the bones out to study for a little while. One of the guests at my parents' Thanksgiving dinner was one of the sociology professors at the university that my dad taught at. He was watching the football game with my dad and brother. He saw the box, and he asked me, "What do you have there, Kendall?" And I told him, "It's a box of bones. I have to study it for anatomy class." He said, "Real bones? Real human bones?" And I said, "Yes, real human bones." He walked over and picked up one of the long bones. "Which one is this?" he said. "It's the femur," I told him. He turned to my dad and said, "Art, I thought we were the only guests coming today," showing my dad the femur. My dad replied, "Don't worry, he won't be eating any of the dessert. Kendall didn't bring his head home." They laughed and went back to watching the game. Classic dad jokes. Shortly after Thanksgiving, we took the test over the bones. After the test was taken, we had to turn the bones and the skull in. They had been my constant companion, hanging out with me at my apartment, going home with me on Thanksgiving, and accompanying me to school. It was a little sad to turn them in, but if I had wanted to pass the class, I had to do it. When I handed over the box and the bag with the skull in it, the contents were evaluated, no damages of note were found, and off the bones and the skull went to be given to the next student. I never saw them again. Our time together had ended. It was just our friendship was never meant to last. It just wasn't meant to be. As a side note, recently, the University of Kansas School of Medicine in my hometown of Wichita, Kansas, has begun incorporating virtual reality technology into their anatomy lab teaching, along with cadaver dissection, and are soon opening a state-of-the-art anatomy lab that will include both VR and cadavers. Maybe with all the technology options, the skull and the bones will finally be able to stop taking public transportation, and their journey will finally come to an end. The next case occurred much later, long after my medical school career had ended. First, I have to give you a little background information. Part of working as a medical examiner is working with other agencies, including the United States Customs and Border Protection agencies. They have officers and agents stationed at 328 ports of entry in the United States, which includes major airports and some minor airports. Their job is to enforce immigration and agricultural laws and prevent illegal items from entering into the country that could be potentially hazardous. At cbp.gov, there is an extensive list of what these items are that can't come into the country, and they include things like alcohol, fruits and vegetables, livestock, switchblades, illegal drugs, certain animal products, products made with prison labor, explosives, and Kinder eggs. The list goes on and on. One really odd item I noticed was dog and cat fur, and if anybody out there is in the market for dog and cat fur, I have plenty of it readily available at my home at any moment, and I'd be happy to share it with you for a reasonable price. When Customs and Border Patrol finds these items in someone's luggage, they can confiscate them. The person can contest it, but it depends on if they were legally bringing it into the U.S. and have the proper paperwork and declared it, and they might get it back. But if they don't, and they were found to be bringing it in illegally, depending on what it is, they can be fined or possibly arrested, and the item is confiscated and either destroyed or taken by the government and used. For packages that are coming through ports of entry, Customs and Border Patrol employs X-ray scanners and trained dogs to sniff out specific items like explosives and drugs. Nowadays, they even use artificial intelligence. Sometimes the items that are found and seized are human remains, specifically bones. And that brings us to the next story. 2 decades ago, you could buy skulls online, and sometimes they would end up in packages or luggage going through the airport. Up until July of 2016, you were actually able to buy human remains of all kinds, but especially bones, on eBay. And a lot of them were used for craft projects. There were reports published in the literature of the online skeletal market, noting not all states have laws about the sale of human remains. The only federal law prohibits the trafficking of Native American human remains, and it is known as the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, which was created in 1990. In the reports, the top price for a skull online was around $5,000, and the origin of 10% of the skulls was vague or unclear. So the question was, where did the skulls come from? It was documented in one article that California had the most sale of skulls, and Missouri was second, and the majority of the skulls were coming from international sellers. Since July of 2016, though, eBay has created a policy where human parts or items containing body parts are not allowed to be sold on the website. Their official policy, located on their customer service page, states that human body parts or items containing body parts are not allowed to be sold on eBay, which includes first-class relics. I didn't know what those are, and I had to look that up. And those are basically religious artifacts or parts of saints, like, St. Francis's fingers. They also include funeral items like urns are also not allowed to be sold. The only exception is items containing human scalp hair, such as locks or wigs. eBay does go on to state that they will remove the listing or other content, issue a warning, and they will restrict your activity or suspend your account. They say that their policy helps to ensure that important government regulations are followed. Even though eBay has stopped the sale of skulls, there's still a market for them online, which you can just as easily type in human skulls and find places that are selling them. And there are places that actually sell first-class relics too, just in case you're looking for them. Before eBay banned human skulls, though, I was working in Chicago. We got a call from the U.S. Customs and Border Patrol agent based at O'Hare International Airport. She stated that during a routine package screening, a package coming through from China heading to Michigan was flagged for further inspection. It had a curious invoice on it, stating that contents were plastic dental moldings. The canine unit dogs didn't smell anything out of the ordinary, but when the package was x-rayed, it wasn't dental moldings at all. It was actually 2 fully intact human skulls with attached mandibles and all their teeth. So technically it could have been dental related. The skulls were obviously human, and the question became, who were they? Where did they come from? Were they acquired legally? And that's when the medical examiner's office got involved. They contacted us, and the skulls were brought to the office, and the case was assigned to me. When I evaluated them, they were not plastic dental moldings. They were actually 2 fully intact human skulls, packed in bubble wrap and tissue paper. They had survived the journey from China quite well and didn't have any fractures. They were fully cleaned of tissue and bleached white. They were obviously meant for research. They didn't exhibit any evidence of injury. Upon examining the cranial cavity, it was devoid of tissue. So in this type of case, where all that is left is bones, most offices will consult a forensic anthropologist to further evaluate them. And that's what we did in this case. When the forensic anthropologist reviewed the skulls, he agreed that there was no evidence of injury. He stated that the skulls appeared to be that of middle-aged males of Asian ancestry. How the skulls escaped the rest of their body is unknown because he couldn't tell either. Were they killed? Did they die of natural causes? Or were they removed by a trophy-hunting alien? It's all up for debate. Attempts were made to contact the sender and the recipient to no avail. The skulls had no one that would claim them or knew anything about them. I made the cause and manner of death undetermined. After that, the death investigators reached out to the Chinese embassy. The embassy helped facilitate the return of the skulls to China. What happened to them after that, I have no idea. Hopefully, they were actually reunited with the rest of their bodies and appropriately buried or cremated. and were not repackaged and sent to somewhere else in Michigan. The last case we're going to talk about is a case of a couple who had just bought a new home on the south side of Chicago. As they were moving in, they found the previous owner had left behind some boxes and some other items. The majority of the boxes were full of old papers and notebooks. And when the husband went up into the attic, it was quite dirty, and he noticed in the corner 2 more boxes. One box, again, was just old papers, and he didn't really look at them and promptly threw it away. And the other box was labeled fan parts. When he opened up the box, he instantly saw 2 skulls sitting in the box mixed with other long bones. The owner instantly panicked, ran down the stairs, told his wife, and they called the police. They were concerned that the previous owner had murdered the individuals and was possibly a serial killer. The story of the victims of John Wayne Gacy being found in his crawl space a little over 20 years earlier were still being talked about around the city, and finding remains like this always made people instantly nervous. And for good reason, because who knows, it could be another serial killer. The police responded and looked at the box and determined the contents were probably human, and the remains came to the medical examiner's office, and once again they became my case. When I evaluated them, they came in a dusty, water-damaged box labeled with a 1970s style graphic and writing on it stating fan parts. I opened it up and revealed the contents. Inside there were 2 human skulls. They did not have their mandibles, not all their teeth, and what teeth there were markedly worn down, almost flattened. Also in the box were different bones, femurs, tibia, fingers, toes, part of a pelvis, some ribs, and a vertebrae. They weren't bleached and clean, and weren't anatomic specimens meant for teaching. They were dirty and weathered. Some of the bones were beginning to crumble, and there was a fair amount of dust in the box. I evaluated each of the bones, and again saw no evidence of injury. Once more, a forensic anthropologist was consulted. He agreed that there was no obvious evidence of injury. He determined, based on morphology and other findings, that the bones were that of ancient human beings. He specifically pointed out the wear on the teeth was consistent with an ancient diet of tough, unprocessed, and abrasive foods, which are normal and common findings with an ancient population. There were other findings, too, that further corroborated this. And he felt the skulls were easily over 100 years old, maybe even closer to 1,000 years old, and he felt that they were most consistent with ancient South American rainforest Indians. Because of this, no cause of manner death were issued, because they were historical remains, and there'd be no idea of how they died. And the investigators looked into the owner of the house. It turned out the individual was actually an old anthropologist who had died, so the assumption was that he had kept some of the specimens that he had reviewed over the years, and for whatever reason had placed them in that box and stuck them in his attic. Maybe he just didn't know what to do with them or how to get rid of them. We contacted several South American embassies, and they didn't want them. And so the bones had nowhere to go. They had no home. And the person who originally had them was long since passed away. We were out of options for someone to take the bones. In this situation, what can we do? Sometimes in cases like this, we will bury them with other unidentified bodies in pauper graves. In this case, the investigators reached out to a museum and asked if they had an interest in taking them, and ultimately they did end up taking them and probably put them in one of their specimen collections. In recent years, I know a lot of the museums are working very hard to return all their collections of bones to the proper tribes or proper countries from which they came. I like to think those 2 rainforest Indians were part of this, and were returned, finally making it back to the land from which they came, and being properly buried by someone who cared. And those bones' fantastic journey had finally come to an end. And that brings us to the end of the episode. I hope you learned something, like your bones are just waiting to go on their own adventure after you die, and I hope you were entertained. Until the next time.